to the point where we have agreed with the Audit Commission, who are our auditors, that effectively we are going to withdraw the version of accounts that was presented to them at the 30th of June. And I thought it was important to give you an update on how those issues came around and indeed why I believe they will not recur. And I think the problems have arisen really from three main factors. The first one is IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards, which I think have been discussed here a couple of times before. And to cut a very long story short, that is an entirely different way of presenting our accounts from the way we've traditionally produced them in the past. Now that's one issue, but the compounding issue linked to that is that so that it's possible to spot trends over a number of years, we, along with every other authority, was effectively required to reproduce the previous 2 financial years' sets of accounts in the new format. So the finance team effectively, instead of closing one set of accounts for the recently gone financial year, had to produce accounts for 3 sets of financial years. So that was issue 1. Issue 2 related to the fact that in response to that change, CIPFA, Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, produced what they called a toolkit to assist authorities in undertaking the new form of accounts. And unfortunately, as the work progressed, it was discovered that there were numerous, and I do mean numerous, errors in the suite of spreadsheets that we and others had been presented with. Now, a lot of authorities then decided to drop the CIPFA toolkit because it didn't work. Those that decided to drop it at an early stage probably made the wise decision and they developed their own spreadsheets to do the work. We stuck with the toolkit until quite late on in the process, and I suspect that was a mistake. Because it certainly didn't help in terms of resolving errors and getting the accounts to a decent condition by the 30th of June. And the third, rather more prosaic issue that was faced by Paul's team was that he effectively had 2 vacancies out of, I think, 5 or 6, 5.5 FTE accountants at the time. One of those was a fairly straightforward vacancy, and the other one was that Paul's deputy was on maternity leave at the time. So he was down on a third of his accountants. He had 3 years' accounts to produce rather than 1, and we were using a recommended toolkit to do it that frankly didn't do the job very well. Now, I think, with hindsight, probably what we ended up with by the 30th of June wasn't a final set of accounts that had some errors in it. I think the reality is we simply hadn't finished the work at the time, but because there is a statutory deadline to produce accounts, I think we drew a line under what we'd got at the time and we submitted them. In conversation with our auditors, the Audit Commission, it is clear that we had not got to an acceptable point where we could consider those accounts in any way, shape or form finished. Hence the conclusion with the Audit Commission that we would withdraw the accounts, they will continue their audit work. Effectively, that will then lead us to then submit a version of accounts which they will be happy to sign off. I think it's probably worth saying a few words about the future, because of course if I were you I'd be thinking, well, okay, we've had these problems, but are we going to see them again? As I've said, I firmly believe we won't. The problem about having to do 3 sets of accounts rather than 1 has now passed. Those years' accounts are now, or will be in the next month or so, in the appropriate format for IFRS. So next year the finance team will be back to only having to close 1 set of accounts. I'm not sure whether CIPFA's toolkit will be in any better condition than it is now, but we have already spoken to a couple of authorities who developed their own suites of spreadsheets to support the work and who did so very successfully, and we are currently talking to 2, as I say, about purchasing their spreadsheets to use as a basis for doing our closure of accounts work. And finally, the two vacancies in Paul's team that I referred to, effectively they're now filled. The one that was a real vacancy has now been filled, and the person that was on maternity leave has now returned to work. So I think the combination of those factors is what caused the problem, and I strongly believe that now that those factors are no longer present, we will not see a recurrence of these issues next year. I think the final thing I wanted to say and I would say it's a surprise to me, is just to mention a potential sanction for missing the deadline of the 30th of June. Cut a very long story short, there is no sanction for missing that deadline, which I have to say I do find slightly extraordinary. The sanction in years gone by is that we would have had a black mark in relation to our performance assessment, but with the abolition of that regime, there is no longer a sanction. Those of you who are familiar with private sector accounting will know that if a private company fails to submit their accounts on time, there is a financial penalty to them. That does not apply to us. Frankly, the sanction is the embarrassment and loss of professional pride for both Paul and myself that we failed to meet that deadline. And I think that's all I'd want to say, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Yes, I mean, in a way we saw this coming, and members will remember we did press the Audit Commission when they were here very heavily about the need for the 3-year, moving the accounts, looking back 3 years with the recast accounts. And so we have the outcome in front of us. And if one thinks of the cost, not just to us, but to every council in the land, of undertaking this exercise, it becomes quite extraordinary. However, I don't know if members, before we sort of change our recommendation a bit from where it stands on the paper, because the paper is recommending that Nick and I and the auditors get together and sign off the accounts. Well, I think since the paper has been written, the view has changed as to what the most appropriate way forward would be. And certainly I would be much more comfortable if the accounts were presented to the committee for approval and that we signed the accounts at that stage, rather than just having 3 people do it in a back room somewhere. But before we move to the recommendation, does anyone have any questions? Margaret.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm relieved that you're going to change the recommendation. I spoke to Darren, I can't remember if it was Friday morning or Monday morning, about this very issue, and he agreed with me that it was not good practice to have one member signing off the accounts with officers. So that's a relief. But I've got a number of questions about what I've heard. I think we're very lucky that there aren't any sanctions. And it surprises me a little that we didn't pick up the problems with the toolkit and do something about that a bit earlier. The previous 2 years' accounts had been done, had been finalised, had gone through all the processes, so it should have been easy to get those in the right format and follow it on. And it is a good thing, I think, to be able to see trends and patterns. So I'm pleased that that change has been made so that we can do that. But do we not have temporary maternity cover? Do we keep posts totally vacant whilst we've got somebody on maternity leave? That seems to me a very strange thing for the council to be doing, particularly in an area as crucial as finance. And to get us into this really uncomfortable situation, and I don't think any of us are comfortable with what's happened and what is happening, that's something we really ought to be thinking about.
Thank you, Chairman. No, we don't obviously automatically keep a post vacant when someone's on maternity leave. We look at each case on a case-by-case basis. One of the other issues which I don't think hugely affected the issue here was that we had someone who was effectively in the redeployment pool from the tail end of BPR, and rather than take on a temp, we decided to use that person to partly fill the gap. Now, they're a good accounting technician type person. They did some good work, but they're not of the quality of someone like Lynn, who they were replacing, the Deputy Head of Finance. So again, perhaps with hindsight, we might have made a different decision. I'm not sure we would, but I can see the argument that Councillor Cooksey is making, and there is certainly some merit in it. So yes, I can see what you're saying. I'm not sure we would have made a different decision.
And can I come back on that, Mr. Chairman? Because that makes it sound as if we had somebody in that post, whereas what we were told before was that there wasn't anybody in that post for that period of time, and that a third of the team were down. Now, either there was or there wasn't. Now we know that there was somebody who wasn't qualified doing it, so there was either 5 or 6 people in post, or 4 people in post, 4 or 5 people in post. Either way round, clearly the whole processes we've been through in the last number of years have meant that the department is running on half full and not functioning as well as it needs to, and that's something else we need to take into account.
I think, yes, I mean, the question of a post being held open, one of the posts was held, wasn't it, on the back of the BPR backwash. Yeah. But
And Councillor Crookston is absolutely right in picking up the subtle distinction in what I was saying. Yes, we were down on fully qualified accountants, but there was a pair of hands there, but not every pair of hands is absolutely the same, of course. Councillor Crookston is also right that the risk of a performance issue is undoubtedly greater in finance and in many other of our teams now as a result of a reduced level of staffing. Needless to say, we believe that those risks are still acceptable risks. That's not to say we will never have any kind of performance issue anywhere, but the risks are undoubtedly higher, and that is a conscious decision we made. But in a way, we had no choice but to make the savings we made. I would suggest that we were far better off trying to make those through effectively efficiency savings, but alongside those you do carry some additional risk, rather than not seeking to find efficiencies, and if you like, throwing our hands up and saying, well, it's got to come through putting a red line through things. So I do believe that Paul's team has got the right resource to do the job, doesn't have a great degree of buffer or slack to take up any pressure if things do go astray. But that's a price you have to pay for not having that slack, I guess. And if I could ask you, I realised I didn't answer another point that you made earlier on, if I could briefly. Yes, we have had, the last 2 years have been closed, the accounts have been closed absolutely perfectly, they've been signed off. But the point about IFRS is it requires us to produce our accounts in an entirely different format. Now, I'm not going to pretend that, therefore, when we have to recast the previous 2 years, it's absolutely like doing them from scratch. It's not entirely doing them from scratch, but it is not far off that. The work involved is not far off actually having to do them from point A.
Thank you, Nick. And just for clarity, what's the current staffing arrangements in Paul's team?
Thank you, Chairman. You have